Welcome, everyone, to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor J Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your host, Pastor J Munson.
Hi, this is J Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. The abortion debate has been raging in this country for decades and has recently been cracked wide open with the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. It is an issue that has long divided Christians, not to mention Americans in general. And here to help us to navigate this issue from a Christian perspective and from the perspective of Christian church history and theology and American history is Mako Nagasawa, and he is the director of the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry in Boston, Massachusetts, which writes curriculum and teaches how early Christian restorative justice and healing atonement are relevant for today's racial and political issues. He's also the author of a great book, Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the United States, which is a very helpful contribution to the abortion discussion. And I think we'll have some surprises for us as we continue on with our interview. Welcome, Mako, to the show.
Thank you so much, SJ, for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Now, I mentioned you deal with restorative justice and healing atonement. Those are some weighty terms that perhaps our listeners may not be familiar with. Can you unpack those terms for us and tell us why they're significant, particularly in how Christians see issues of social justice and political issues or politicized issues like abortion and so forth?
Yes, absolutely. So the early Christians, and this continues in the Orthodox and Catholic traditions and some Protestant traditions, believe that God's justice is restorative and not retributive. So, or at least primarily restorative. And the main idea there being that that it's very similar to how in criminal justice today we are thinking about restorative justice because we have a mass incarceration problem, the militarized policing, and so on and so forth. And so how is it that perhaps offenders can be responsible to victims by helping to undo the harm that they've caused? But what if we were victim-centric? And so the idea is that in retributive justice, we're backward-looking and offender-centric, like something has to be done back to an offender that's proportional, hopefully, to what he or she did. But in restorative justice, we're forward-looking and we're victim-centric. We ask the victim, what do you need to move forward or move on? And if there's a way for the offender to participate, then let's bring in some dialogue. Now, on a theological level, it seems that the early Christians believed that this is what was happening in Christ and leading up to Christ through Israel. That when God said, you've got a corrupted human nature and you do things to make it worse, therefore I want you to circumcise your hearts, O Israel, in Deuteronomy 10, verse 16. Meaning, if you internalize the commandments that I've given you deeply enough, you will cut something away from yourself. You are both kind of the victim and the offender in that sense, and so God's justice is restorative, and His commands are more like the commands of a doctor who has a really a health regimen that is for our good, and he shares it with us so that we could participate in the healing of our human nature. So in the end, Jesus comes into a fallen human nature to do battle with it, because we couldn't fully live up to the health regimen. He fully internalized it. He transfigured and healed human nature through his death and resurrection, and shares the healing of our humanity with us by his Spirit. So that's basically how healing, atonement, and restorative justice connect.
Great. Well, thanks for explaining that. The Protestant Christianity has been a dominant force, both politically and religiously in this country. And as you point out, has tended to focus more on a retributive or forensic criminal or legal perspective on the atonement. That is, that Jesus, that sin is radical disobedience to God, which is a crime. It deserves the death penalty, and Jesus's death on the cross pays the penalty for our crime, and so forth and so on.
Right.
And perhaps it has taken that, as you point out, that slant at the expense of other historically Christian theological interpretations of the atonement. How has this been significant in how we as evangelical Christians in this country view an issue like abortion?
Well, I think the issue is that when you try to fit an issue like abortion into a retributive justice framework, you're immediately launched into questions like, who's to blame and how do we punish them? And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of, or a few states become very retributive in their policies. And so it either on, we punish the doctor, or it's a felony, or it's a murder to perform an abortion. And now I think we are also, or some states are also criminalizing the woman's role as well, or at least that's being attempted. And that is noteworthy and unusual, because for the past few decades, I think conservatives of all stripes would have said that the mother, the woman, is the second victim in an abortion. Like the primary victim is the fetus, but the woman is the secondary victim. And they didn't think of the woman as the perpetrator in terms of policy. But now they are moving in that direction. And that is disturbing, I think, because I don't think we appreciate how much we are actually putting doctors into the role of a moral dilemma, to turn away a woman who is impoverished, desperate, suicidal, perhaps. That's a moral dilemma. Certainly, I think we're putting women and their families in moral dilemmas of their own, and I don't think we're asking forward-looking questions like, how do we reduce the abortion rate? How do we treat this less as a criminal justice issue and more as a social welfare issue and a public welfare, public health issue? Because we know, for example, that poverty drives up the abortion rate. So why is the modern anti-abortion, pro-life movement wedded to kind of an economic vision that wants to dismantle social supports, ship jobs overseas, and decimate communities, in all kinds of ways? So I think that would be, the basic contrast of a retributive versus restorative justice approach to the issue of abortion.
Now, you in your book, you look at what Scripture says, or at times doesn't say, about the beginnings of human life in the womb, and in fact, you show that the Bible is not as clear as we would like to think about this issue. What sort of things did you discover in your research, and what do you think are the ramifications of that?
Well, that Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25, is by far and away the single most important passage that we need to deal with, because it deals with the situation of when a fetus is harmed in the womb, what should we do? And, I want to put out the caveat. This is part of Jewish law, and whenever Christians read and appreciate and try to honor Jewish law, that we have to go through at least some thoughtful translation process, because we usually don't just immediately apply Jewish law to ourselves or to a society that we're in. So I think we have to understand the passage on its terms. But having said that, there are a whole bunch of other passages that people often reference, Psalm 139 or Jeremiah 1, that say things like, God knew me in my mother's womb, or called me or while I was in the womb. And those are important too, but those are just not enough. They're not specific enough. They don't even deal with the situation of what if the unborn is harmed in the womb, or what if there's some kind of moral trade-off that we need to be thinking about between the mother and the fetus, or some other configuration of moral value there. So Exodus 21 is really important. Should I go on and immediately, or just talk about that?
Please. No, this is great. Please go on.
Well, the situation in Exodus 21 is one of bodily harm. And all of the passages, or the examples in Exodus 21 have to do with some kind of bodily harm or bodily relationship, which makes sense because God had just delivered Israel out of Egypt, where they had suffered a lot of bodily harm and bodily restriction and things like that. And so that's going to, it makes sense that the first order of business, or after the Ten Commandments, is apply the Ten Commandments in situations of bodily harm. And so the situation in verse 22 starts off with when people are fighting and someone hits a pregnant woman. And if you're reading the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, it says, and there's a miscarriage, then the woman's husband, basically with the judges of the community, talk about a fine. But if there is harm to the woman, to the mother, then you use the eye for eye, life for life principle, tooth for tooth, and so on. And so that's called the lex talionis, and that, I think, is an outer limit of compensation anyway, so it is a fine, and by the time that Babylon comes in and takes over Israel and deports the Israelites to Babylon, they lose the ability to carry out capital punishment, and so it becomes a fine anyway. So that's important because it is still an eye for eye, but it's more a restorative justice principle of if I hurt your eye, I become your second eye. And there's a symmetry between verses 18 and 19, which is another incident of bodily harm, and a restorative compensation and service to that person. So in the NRSV, that's what happens, and the fact that the fetus is not compensated, or the woman or the family of the unborn is not compensated at full, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, indicates that the fetus is not given full personhood. It's still valuable. There is still a fine attached, and but we can be fairly certain that it's not given full personhood. That is amazing. And what's even more amazing is that's the Hebrew Masoretic text, the text that the Jewish community consolidated and finally kind of put together in about the 9th century. But the Greek Septuagint translation, which dates back to about 250 BC, it was translated by supposedly 70 Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. It was approved of by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So it was an approved translation into Greek, because you have a lot of, like kids of immigrants or a diaspora community. They don't speak the mother tongue. They know Greek better than Hebrew. And so the Jewish scholars and rabbis needed to produce a translation in the common tongue, which was Kini or Koine Greek, which was the language almost everyone spoke there. And that translation of Exodus 21 says, if there's a miscarriage, then you look at the miscarriage and say, how formed was it? Was it unformed? Was the fetus unformed, or was it formed? And so if it's unformed, then you go with the fine. If it's formed, then you treat the fetus with full personhood. It's life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And again, I think that's the outer limit, the upper limit of compensation. And I can explain that more if you'd like. But that's what's interesting, is that we have two different manuscript families, the Hebrew Masoretic and the Greek Septuagint. Neither one of them say or would suggest that conception is where you start treating the fetus as a full person. It's some point later on. And so many of the Christians, and this is a longer story, understood that, hey, we have a text in two variations. We don't know which one is the kind of more authentic. So let's look at the science of the day. They looked at Greek science like Aristotle, or Greek doctors like Galen and Hippocrates, and the early church actually knew that they were deciding on different pastoral policies, and they had different directions in which they went on the fetus and abortion. It's amazing.
Now, you studied the early church fathers for your research, and in your book you trace the position of the early church on the issue of abortion, or I should say positions, because apparently there were a variety of views. Can you outline some of those views that the early church took, and why they should be or are significant for us?
Yes. So I break up the church for practical purposes into Greek, Latin, and Syriac speaking. And so the Greek speaking church that was centered in Asia Minor and Greece and Constantinople kind of followed Basil of Caesarea and a few other Greek-speaking bishops. Now, they were really intelligent people. Basil was also a trained doctor. He took the Hippocratic Oath. Other bishops in the Greek world were also trained physicians. And it was the policy of Hippocrates and Galen to not perform abortions. So those are the secular, or the pagan Greek doctors. And the reason why they did that was because they believed that the father's sperm contained the whole human being. So and that the mother provided the nourishment and the incubation of the fetus. Now, there's some male bias there, to be sure. But if we're trying to go by just trying to be sympathetic and saying, well, look, I mean, that's one possible conclusion that you could have, not having microscopes and things like that. I mean, what do we observe? Semen, and so the assumption was that the sperm contained the whole human being, and so to do anything to the sperm was to interfere with a formed human being and with personhood. So that's what Basil of Caesarea and the Greek Orthodox, or the Eastern Orthodox on the whole, went with. Now, they used the Greek Septuagint version of the translation of the Old Testament, especially Exodus 21, which talked about, well, is the fetus unformed or is it formed? And so I went to an Orthodox seminary. I really appreciated it, loved the experience, got the Orthodox Study Bible and opened the book up to Exodus 21, and there are no notes about how it is that the Orthodox Church believes basically life begins at conception and we perform no abortions. However, in Exodus 21, it's not as strict as that. So they went actually beyond Scripture but it's because they looked to the science of their day and said, well, what's the kind of better safe than sorry route that we know? And it's this. And they, interestingly, also believed in the scientific view that the father's sperm contained the whole human being. So, they did do that. The Latin West went a different direction. They said, we're going to select Aristotle, and we are going to major on the Greek Septuagint in terms of the fetus and abortion. And so Aristotle believed that the male fetus was formed at 40 days of gestation during the pregnancy, and that the female fetus was formed at 90 days. In other words, when did the fetus kind of look human? And don't ask me why he landed on the 40 days and 90 days, male, female. I have no idea really, but I'm sure there's some male chauvinism there. But the idea was that coordinated with what the Greek Septuagint version of Exodus 21 was saying. And so somewhere along the way, it was believed that God ensouled the fetus at some point after the fetus was formed, after the fetus looked human enough. And that was called quickening. It was the point of ensoulment, and quickening was when the mom felt the baby kick in the womb. And it was anywhere between like 1/3 to 1/2 of the stage of the pregnancy, a way through the pregnancy. And that was what the Catholic Church believed until 1869. That's what they taught. And so early abortion was permitted in the Latin West, in the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Puritans, the Americans. At the time of the writing of the U.S. Constitution, early abortion before quickening was acceptable. It was legal under English common law. And that only started to change much later, so decades later, and that's an interesting story by itself. But that was, the Latin West, and then the Syriac Church actually has a bunch of different views. It held to a book called the Didache, which, if folks are on social media after the Dobbs decision, they might have seen a graphic that said the Didache, chapter 2, verse 2 says, "Do not abort a child, or kill a child after it's born." And and it says something like Christianity has been against abortion for 2,000 years. And the thing, and that's true, that what the Didache is, it's kind of like an early manual on how to organize a church. But the Syriac-speaking church seemed to have really valued this. There's another document later called Apostolic Constitutions that says the Didache is scripture, but we interpret it using the Greek Septuagint. So what does it mean for the child to be a child? Well, it is at the point of formation and ensoulment. And so the Didache was interpreted by the Syriac tradition in that way. It was not interpreted as we ban all abortions from day one. It was interpreted as, well, some abortions, the early abortions, are acceptable. So, so it gets complex, and it's a fascinating story. There's a few other, documents to pay attention to and be aware of. But you see the early church by the 4th century knowing that there's this very relevant pastoral question. Everyone wants to take infanticide and abortion quite seriously and protect the vulnerable. That is a Christian ethic, but they're not sure exactly how to do it because there's a difference in manuscripts and difference in the science, the opinions of the scientists of their day. It is really striking.
When did we come to a point as American Christians that we were so sure about when life begins and about the crime of abortion and so forth? It seems like there was such a variety of thought in the ancient world. When did we become, so sure that we're right about this?
Right. That's a really important question. Well, it depends on whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. And so if you're Catholic, in 1869, the Catholic Church officially changed its position. It said, we recognize that we relied on Aristotle as scientists, but now we know a little bit more about the embryo, stages of formation of the fetus, and so we are going to say that it's conception. Personhood begins not with quickening, but at conception. And the reason they did that formally was what's called moral probability, or there's a probability that we don't know, but it's kind of a better safe than sorry type of reasoning. Like as long as it's morally probable that God ensouls the fetus from the day one, from fertilization, then we should ban the practice of abortion. So that's the thing, though, that's going on, because the Catholic Church was responding to science as if it were afraid of it, or as if science were a foe. Why do we see that? Or why do I say that? Well, because in 1870, just 1 year later, at Vatican I, they declared the doctrine of papal infallibility. So that's the idea that the Pope is never wrong when he speaks in an official capacity, sits on the chair, speaking ex cathedra. And you could see from this and some other things that, so there's this response to science. There's a concern about science, because what was going on was Darwin's theory was being popularized, and it challenged the worst possible interpretation of Genesis 1, which is the 6 24-hour day period, which is not the only interpretation, and there are much better ones. But it did challenge that, and there were others. There was kind of another movement to study Scripture in a scientific way, and so that made Scripture out to be kind of a compromise document, a political compromise, kind of like the U.S. Constitution between slave states and free states. You can see who wrote what, who was interested in what, and it was a compromise that held the community together. They thought that you could do that with Scripture. There's different schools of thought in Israel that did not agree with the points of tension and so on. And so they looked for the sources. And that actually, for the Catholics, really threatened, or they really felt strongly about that. They worked hard against that. And the car, and both of those things made sex easier for young people. And so it was thought to be ruining society, and so that's some of the things that the Catholic Church was responding to. Protestants responded similarly, but not using abortion right away. In 1902, I believe that there was the fundamentalists, the evangelical fundamentalists, published a pamphlet called The Fundamentals, and they argued for biblical infallibility because, of course, they're not going to follow the Pope, but they do, like the Catholics, the Protestants did want to kind of answer the questions that science was challenging them with. How do you know anything? How do you know that anything in Christian faith is true, or reliable and authoritative? So that's when they came up with that, and then the story gets pretty textured. In 1840, from 1840 there were some doctors who put together the American Medical Association, and they put together anti-poisoning laws. They were mostly Protestant, and some people look at those laws and say this was the beginning of the anti-abortion laws, in a sense, but also not exactly, because the laws were anti-poisoning. They were against the quacks, right? The doctors wanted to prevent the quacks running around with their snake oil solutions and selling them, especially selling poison to women, ostensibly to cause abortions. And the licensed doctors said, we don't want this. And meanwhile, though, they did perform abortions in their clinics. A few decades later, in the North and to some degree in the West, the elite Anglo-Saxon Protestant doctors noticed that there were a lot of Catholics coming into the country from Italy, Ireland, Germany, Poland, and they were having big families. Meanwhile, white Protestant women were getting abortions very frequently. And it was the doctors, Dr. I think Horatio Storer, one of the founders of the AMA, who used a racial replacement theory that said, hey, we are being replaced because what white meant back then was only Protestant and Anglo-Saxon. It did not include other European ethnicities and did not include the Catholics. And so this was the rise of the Know-Nothing Party and the really anti-immigrant sentiment in the North. And so some ministers joined in. And so, it was doctors and ministers who were men. Women didn't have the right to vote then. They started to put together anti-abortion laws in the North and the West. So they were trying to basically control reproduction of WASP women and to have more kids. Theodore Roosevelt, for example, was in favor of this and went around making speeches saying, hey, our women need to have more babies because we're being replaced by these big Catholic families. And meanwhile, the South did not follow it. They held on to quickening in their state laws. Into the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, depending on which state, because biracial children after the Civil War could not be enslaved anymore. So it was just an economic and a social cost. If you're a black woman and raped, you probably want an abortion. Or if you were a white woman and had a sexual relationship with a man of color, your family probably pressured you to get an abortion. So the southern states actually held on to quickening for several decades longer, which is amazing. And again, this was with a Protestant understanding. It wasn't until 1979, 1980 where the Protestants, with Jerry Falwell, Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, and the moral majority started to say, hey, we're really concerned about abortion. But it was part of Reagan's anti-communist platform. So Reagan and white evangelicals and libertarians and foreign policy hawks kind of made common cause by being anti-communist. So, what characterized Reagan was big-time military spending against the USSR in the Cold War. He expanded the deficit because he wanted to raise taxes to pay for it. Meanwhile, he used some of that military equipment to militarize the police domestically, and that touches on his domestic policy. So he's anti-communist abroad, and he's kind of quote-unquote anti-communist domestically because he wants to dismantle the New Deal state regulations, social support, public education, funding for mental health, all these things he slashes. And because it's easy to call that communism. The white evangelical church gets on board with this because very interesting quote and says, this is how we fundraise. We fundraise using abortion as the first issue. It's the sharp here, and it gets people very passionate. We're talking about people, and the idea is, why do people have abortions? Well, it's because they're not trusting God in one way or another. And so it's atheism or functional atheism. And who organizes the atheists? It's the communists. So the abortion becomes part of an anti-communist, pro-capitalist platform, which is why it has taken on the retributive character that it has today over the last few decades. That's what has been kind of stitching together the Republican Party. It was involved in the strategy of bringing Southern white evangelicals from the Democratic Party in the South to the GOP. And it uses the paradigm that if you have sex before you're ready, you have before you experience some poverty or economic hardship. And that's very different with the Catholic Great Depression. They saw the abortion rate spike because of poverty and said, we believe poverty drives the abortion rate, so we want to bring down poverty, and we want to use the federal government to do that. So we're pro-union, high minimum wages, protect people from banks and mass indebtedness. In the 1980s, when the Republican Party, so the Catholics were New Deal Democrats largely, the Republican Party co-opted the anti-abortion cause and connected it to a very retributive capitalist paradigm where poverty is the stick motivation. It's the looming threat that should be held over everyone's head so that they don't have sex before they're ready or they don't have kids when they shouldn't. So, I mean, that is the long-ish answer to your question. It is a really sobering history.
Thank you so much for outlining that history. That's, as I thought, was full of surprising things. We're talking with Mako Nagasawa, who is the author of a book called The Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the United States, a wonderful contribution to the abortion debate from a Christian perspective. The book, one of the things I appreciate about the book, too, is it's not only an honest book, it's a very compassionate book. And when we talk about the reasons behind a woman having abortion, we're talking about various social economic factors, but chief among them, I think, is, as you've mentioned, poverty. And how or why should that be significant in our Christian response to abortion?
Thanks, SJ. That is such an important question because women who are at the poverty line or below have an abortion rate 3 times the level of women who are not in poverty. And I think between 2000 and 2008, the number of abortions, something like 42% of abortions were procured by women in poverty, even though only 15% of the American population is formally in poverty. So there's just a disproportionate impact influence there. And I think you could look at it from the standpoint of, well, what is the reality of life if you're poor? And you can also look at it from the standpoint of how has bad Christian teaching produced a society in which so many people are poor, in which there are cycles of poverty. And so, I think it's important to touch on both. I think that as I was, talking to people and doing research for the book, it stood out to me that women in poverty often have a much harder time than men in poverty, which is due to many factors, sometimes adverse childhood experiences, sometimes more often than not, women are responsible for caring for aging adults more so than men. On the whole, in the aggregate, women make 80 cents on the dollar for every man in terms of wages. I think it's something like closer to 60 cents if you're black or Latino, if you're a woman in those racial categories. That's not to say that within the job there's that disparity. It's just that in the aggregate, the types of jobs that women are able to find. And women have to pay more for everything. They pay more for cars, car insurance, mortgages, because they are more often bullied by salespeople. They pay more for their clothes, for hygiene, for contraception, for their deodorant. So it just costs more to be a woman. And so and women fear more for their physical safety, especially if they are in poverty or in a challenging neighborhood and find it difficult to get a job. So the incentive to get a boyfriend and live with that boyfriend is high, and that's how many women enter into or find themselves in the situation of having an unintended pregnancy and feeling the pressure to abort. It's also worth noting that if you don't have health insurance, on average, delivering a baby in a hospital in the U.S. costs about $15,000. Right? I mean, in California, it's about $26,000. In Arizona, it's something like $19,000. So it's just ridiculously expensive. We talked about the cost of, milk formula, or the cost of childcare being anywhere from $4,000 to $10,000, depending on where you live. And then you compare that to getting an abortion. Medication abortion through pills costs $400 or less. Surgical abortion can cost anywhere from $500. So when we compare the high cost of being poor and the high cost of raising a child, those are really sobering, things to keep in mind. And by the way, that also affects married women as well. I think around 14 to 15% of all abortions in the U.S. are procured by married women, which really challenges the conservative assumption that, hey, if you're married, then you'll be okay. No, not necessarily. And, across the world, the majority of abortions are procured by married women. So that is really sobering. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where we're struggling under mountains of debt and we're paying so much for basic things, childcare, healthcare, and that's not even talking about college tuition or anything that could come along with special needs, mental health, physical health things? Well, a lot of that goes back to John Locke, who was a Christian philosopher and ethicist in England that the U.S. Founding fathers really drew upon heavily. And John Locke said things about private property and ownership of wealth that no Christian really said before him. Before him, everyone interpreted Genesis 1 as God saying, here's the creation, I want all of you to share it with one another. And that was actually part of, having dominion. So if you interfere with someone else's enjoyment of the creation or having dominion, you're sinning, because that's not what God intended from the creation. And Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century was one of the Christian leaders who said, this is why we're against slavery. Well, along comes John Locke in the 1700s and 1800s and says, 1700s, and says, yeah, at first God did that, but then really, if you work harder than the last person, if you enclose your property and improve the land, then you could claim it as your private property, and no one should be able to touch it. You enter into society with private property already, and you should be able to pass it down to your children. The state should not tax you, because taxation is just plain theft, and so that's what Thomas Jefferson really wanted to say in the Declaration and the Constitution. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Benjamin Franklin, among others, said, well, no, because private property is a creation of communities. We come into community first, and then we allocate private property. So this is a real point of disagreement, and it's important to say John Locke, we look back at him, there's a lot of people who look back at him, the libertarians do, or the quote-unquote classical liberals like the Koch brothers, who want minimal interference from government, no regulation, no social safety net, because that involves, taxing people. But essentially, this is what many, many Christians have bought into. And this is, this is why English colonists could come into North America and say that we could take land from Native Americans because they're lazy, we're more productive, and so we could take their land, which was not actually true. And John Locke knew better. But he was the first white person to call non-white people lazy. And it created a culture of overwork. It created a culture where U.S. Citizens fear the smarter immigrant because, look, if we did it to people earlier, then maybe they could do to us. This is why the Charlottesville marchers, who are white supremacists, said Jews will not replace us, because by and large the Jewish community is pretty smart, and we don't want them to replace us. We're nervous about that. So, this is the economic ideology that fuels a lot of thinking. It's the reason why corporations ship jobs overseas. It's why we keep cutting taxes on the rich, and we have trouble funding infrastructure and keeping a basic safety net in place. So, without saying a whole lot of specifics, that is, from a standpoint of Christian heresy, that's a big problem, because John Locke said work makes common things private. But before that, Christians said God made the earth for us to hold in common, and the fruits of the earth belong to everyone. So, when we think about the Christian contribution to poverty, why have we designed economic systems that continue to benefit the wealthy, and where they can leverage that wealth push the rest of us into debt? That is a big concern. And that's a concern regardless of abortion, but especially because of abortion, because, again, people feel the pressure of abortion when they have less and less hope.
You say in your book, today the pro-life movement has misplaced its priorities. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes. Well, I think the modern pro-life movement has wedded itself to a very economic policies that are what we call economic conservatism, or free market fundamentalism. And so we think that basically people get what they deserve, that there's very, very little explanation behind poverty except that, well, those people didn't work hard, or those people had sex when they shouldn't, and they had kids before they were ready. So that's why they're poor and they deserve it. And so in 2017, we done that said white evangelicals especially are more likely to blame poverty on lack of hard work rather than any other factors, structural factors, historical factors like racism or lopsidedness in the labor force or some things like that. So there's that. There's also the fact that we let corporations run amok, and there's almost no accountability, even though we are learning more and more that the biggest contributor to birth defects in the fetus, in the womb, are chemicals. There's pollution, there's plastics, there's a whole bunch of things that cause fetal abnormalities. And if you look at why women or families get abortions in the second and third trimesters, it's almost always related to fetal health and fetal abnormalities, or the mother's health. But essentially, we don't hold the corporations accountable because of our economic ideology. And so essentially, we let corporations get away with putting chemicals into mothers' wombs, but we somehow don't take action about that. That is one of the many reasons why I think the modern pro-life movement, because it has wedded itself to a retributive, pro-capitalist and quote-unquote anti-communist platform, has misplaced its priorities. SJ.
Speaking of accountability, you also talk about the role of men, or that men should have a role in the accountability for the act of abortion. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, partner-related reasons is usually the number one or number two reason for why women get abortions. At least those that fill out these, reports or answer surveys about why did they get an abortion. Usually they did not want this man to be a father, or did not want to co-parent with this father, or change their mind about the man at some point. And it's hard to know what to do with that, but from a broad restorative justice standpoint, I'll throw something out there that I'm sure will be controversial, but should men be taxed more heavily than women for health insurance or just on their taxes? Because of all of the abortions that they cause or that they contribute to. The reason why I would not say that about women is because women already pay a cost in their physical health. They're more vulnerable to ectopic pregnancies, or having placenta problems, or having cervical problems with every abortion. So it's not that the abortion is cost-free to women. They already bear a cost. Doctors already bear a cost one way or the other. If they're under jobs, they may feel a moral cost about turning away a woman who is depressed, suicidal, panicked, because she doesn't want to be pregnant. Or, on the flip side, they may feel a moral cost to waiting, to doing a later term, a second or third trimester abortion. And so everyone is paying a cost, it seems, except on the whole, men. And so, there is a cost to the healthcare system. There's a cost to support women's physical and mental health after abortions that our society then has to pay for. And so why shouldn't men have to pay more in taxes? An even more radical idea would be to give men the option of getting a free vasectomy or pay higher taxes. And I say that because, if Clarence Thomas believes that there is no actual right to privacy and there is no bodily autonomy, then why not do that? What's the reason why men should not be required to, or at least offered to, get a free vasectomy or pay higher taxes? So that's a somewhat serious idea, but it's more of a thought exercise, which I hope you and SJ and our listeners can appreciate, because it's carrying those principles to the same, or into a different realm, or to a different conclusion. I think the retributive impulse is to always be looking for, who's at fault? The restorative impulse is to say, yes, that matters, but also how do we move forward and be forward-looking and not just backward-looking? And so how do we incentivize male responsibility, for instance?
Well, this has been a great and eye-opening discussion. We've been talking with Mako Nagasawa, who is the author of Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the United States. Thank you so much for outlining all that history and theology. It was very, very eye-opening. And your book is available online on Amazon and other online books?
Yes.
So,
SJ, thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the very timely conversation and the chance to talk about this. Yes, it's available at With and Stock Publishers and Amazon and other places that you get used and new books. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. This is S.J. Munson signing off.